So in November 1931, the communist art critic Alfréd Kemény reviewed an exhibition of figurative sculptures held by the artist László Péri in Peri's own studio in Berlin Tempelhof. In the review, published under Kemeny's pen name Durus, he presented Péri as a talented young sculptor whose work has, as he said, some potential, but is ultimately rejected as, I quote, ideologically half-baked. While being characteristic of the habitual sound of politicized art criticism at the time, the condescending tone could seem surprising, however, given the fact that the critic and the sculptor were connected through a close friendship for a decade, since their first days in exile in Berlin. In the years 1921 to 1923, both Kemény as critic and Péri as artists were key figures of the Hungarian constructivist movement in Berlin. In 1921, Kemény imported Russian constructivism to Berlin after having experienced it firsthand in Moscow, where he had met with key figures such as Karl Johansson or the Stenberg brothers. A year later, he prominently prefaced Peri's series of abstract linoleum cuts published by the Berlin editor Der Sturm in 1923. The two of them had also co-signed a manifesto together with László Moholy-Nagy and Ernő Kalay in the Hungarian journal Egizek, in which they opposed Western avant-garde artists like Theo van Doesburg as bourgeois aesthetes and called for a radicalized version of constructivism informed by communist politics. By 1931, Péri had only recently returned to producing sculpture after having abandoned fine art production entirely in 1924 and having turned to architecture, drawing, which he practiced only semi-professionally, and anonymous illustration work for the communist press. And then around 1928 or 1929, he started making small figurative works in clay and plaster, which he would eventually also cast in bronze. So abandoning his earlier commitment to non-objective art and design. While Kemény had by the time become the leading art critic of the German Communist Party adjacent newspaper Die Rote Fahne, Péri had more or less disappeared from the art scene at this moment. Both artists and critics were active in the communist art scene and at least loosely associated with the Association of Revolutionary Visual Artists in Germany, the ASSO, as it was called, a large cultural political organization founded in 1928 to promote so-called proletarian revolutionary art. In my talk, I will examine the historically shifting relationship between the artist and the critics, as symptomatic not so much of their individual careers, but rather of broader tendencies within the context of the communist avant-garde of the Third International and in Weimar Germany more specifically. And what I would like to suggest is that in order to understand the significance of Kemeny's criticism in 1931, it is necessary to determine the shifting meaning of realism in this historical sequence, and especially its conflicting references to, on the one hand, the avant-garde, and on the other hand, the art historical tradition. So why is Peri's work in 1931, quote again, ideologically half-baked? Kemény writes, I quote, "He has what it takes to become a proletarian revolutionary sculptor. He still hasn't become one. He has hardly approached a true-to-life depiction of social reality," end of quote. What is significant here is that the true-of-life depiction of social reality becomes now the main criterion for a successful proletarian art. This hadn't always been the case in Kemeny's writings. Obviously, it couldn't have been the case with his appraisal of Peri's space constructions of the early 1920s, where it was precisely the opposition to naturalist representation, which was qualified by Kemeny as a new realism. But here, realism wasn't meant to signify the true depiction of social life, but rather the utopian aim of plastic design creating a new spatial reality, which for Kemeny would be fully realized only in a communist future. And I cannot say much here about this early text by Kemeny, but maybe I should mention that they had a strong vitalist and strong cosmological overtones. And in Peri's principle of overcoming the limitation of the rectangular picture frame, or generally the picture frame, towards monumental wall design, the critic had identified a step towards a new revolutionary architecture. So here these designs are presented. Oh, can you see? Or the light is very okay. Yeah. Maybe we can do something about this. It would be nice to see the pictures. But if it's too much trouble, I don't know. Okay, that's bad. Ah.
Yeah, maybe, but like with
the projector is.
Yeah, we have to move the projector.
Ah, it's here, yeah.
Yeah, the sun is listening to us actually.
Ah, it's getting better.
All right. We say like 2 minutes. If it doesn't work, we're gonna figure it out. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, San. Yeah. So, okay, what I wanted to highlight here is that these are linoleum cuts, and Péri did these as also to reproduce the work, but actually they aspire to a kind of a monumental architectural design, which I think is already visible in the kind of static and monumental form of these shapes reminiscent of architectural constructions. So and this is a lithography which is actually the design for a very large, you can see here it's 7 meters, a wall design for the Große Berliner Kunstausstellung in 23, and Hubertus Gassner's take is that these were actually done in large painted wooden plates. We can see so these are some photographies of Peri's studio in roughly 1929, and we can see some of these designs probably in wood at the studio wall. So, in any case, the aim here, I will come back now to Kemeny's kind of discussion of these works. In any case, the aim was to realize these constructions as architectural decoration, and therefore in Kemeny's early writings, the realism of constructivism was intrinsically dependent on overcoming the traditional artistic media such as easel painting and sculpture. In an article published in 1924 called From Suprematism to Abstract Design, Kemeny already slightly relativized this utopian aspiration. Now he introduced a distinction in his discussion of current art movements. He introduced a distinction based on national specificities and the difference in historical development and ideologies. In this text, Kemény argues that constructivism is the appropriate art form for the Soviet Union, where the task is to build socialism and to industrialize the country. In the West, however, we witnessed the decay of bourgeois society, so therefore constructivism tends to become formalist, or as he calls it, a romanticism of the machine. And what is needed instead is here a critical realism, here epitomized by the work of artists such as Rudolf Schlichter, Otto Dix, or also the photomontages of John Hartfield. So a critical realism, one that, as Kemény says, doesn't escape into abstraction, but shows the social contradictions of its time. So this is now the kind of opposition, socialist, construction of socialism in the West and decay of bourgeois society in the West. In my view now, the years 1928 until 1931 are decisive in Kemény's and the German Communist Party's turn towards realism as a signifier for revolutionary communist art. So until this point, realism hasn't really been a term that had great importance, but now progressively it becomes a kind of key signifier. But in some respects, I would argue that Kemény's position is much less decided here than one could expect. And I think we should be careful not to retroject the doctrine of socialist realism that was effective as an official state doctrine from 1934 onwards to the years which preceded it. While Kemény's increasing intellectual inflexibility in these years is much a sign of the political pressure from the party as Peri's turn to figuration, the notion of realism, I would argue, remains still open to different possibilities in these years. And when I speak here of intellectual inflexibility, I mean that in these years what counts now for Kemény in his art criticism is mostly the ideological tendency of the artist. So this notion of ideological tendency becomes important here. Between 1928 and 1930, the history of the Association of Revolutionary Visual Artists, so ASO, is marked by an ideological divide between a traditionalist and an avant-gardist position. Initially, the organization took as its model the association of the same name, Association of Revolutionary Artists in Russia, but which defended the heritage of the bourgeois tradition, namely large-scale 19th century painting, which was then history painting, which was then invested with a kind of socialist subject matter. However, in January 1929, Kemény proclaimed the reorientation of the group, now citing the avant-gardist constructivist Oktyabr group, which has also formed in 28 in Moscow, as a major influence. The Oktyabr model suggested that the traditional artistic media, easel painting and sculpture, should be overthrown in favor of the artist becoming a social engineer and designer, as well as producers of non-artistic photography in literature, painting, and film. In a series of articles, Kemény attacked the petty bourgeois activity of painting, claiming instead that the revolutionary artist should become an industrial worker, as is the title here of his article. And I think it is telling that actually here as an illustration, poster work by Alexandre Deineka is used because he really, one could say, embodies this kind of position that is neither traditionalist realism nor avant-gardist constructivism, but rather as a form of social realist modernism, one could say. And I will just say briefly that also László Péri's unrealized model for a Lenin monument was praised by Kemény already in 24, and that what is less known actually is that he had continued during this period to contribute with the design of posters and magazine illustrations for the communist press, alongside with the fellow Hungarian emigres Sándor Ek and Jolan Szilágyi, who are also founding members of the ASO. And so this position between realism and constructivism can I think also be seen in the discussion of Kemeny's discussion of what he in this time calls revolutionary objectivity, and which is he defines as a counter movement to new objectivity, neue Sachlichkeit. However, he addresses, the German group Die Abstrakten, with figures such as Oskar Nerlinger and Alice Lex, would represent this revolutionary objectivity for Kemény. However, he also levels criticism towards them. This type of work, he says, is lauded by him for its didactical clarity and the correct application of Marxist dialectics, but nevertheless the critic complains about their lack of concreteness and their stylistic neutrality and indifference. Nerlinger seems at times dangerously close to Neue Sachlichkeit, as Kemény glosses, I quote, "Dispassionate coldness is not a Marxist virtue." And now I would argue that this is the same type of criticism that he also levels at, oh no, sorry, I forgot one sentence. So again, here he adds that these artists, I quote, they must grasp the dialectic of reality in an even more concrete and multifaceted way. They must become more realistic. Their slogan must be more observations closer to life. And I think that this already kind of anticipates the criticism that he levels at László Péri only a few months later. I will jump now a little bit for a time and go directly again to his discussion of Peri's sculptures. So what he says here is that, I quote again, Peri's work does not even reach the ideological and artistic level of Daumier. The reference to Daumier is not fortuitous, I would say, in this context. It signals that now the artistic tradition of 19th century becomes a normative criterion for evaluating the revolutionary character of socialist art. Socialist art should catch up to the standards of revolutionary bourgeois art and surpass it. Such a normative anchoring in the art historical tradition had been almost completely absent from Kemeny's earlier writings. In his 1938 text, Abstrakte am abstraktesten, abstract, more abstract, most abstract, it is not Daumier who is quoted as a reference, but the frescoes of the German 19th century painter Hans von Marais, which are cited here as a model now for socialist realist history painting. Kemény highlights the fresco's monumentality and the full-blooded realism of the symphony of labor which is presented here. When combined with the idealization of the human figure derived from classical art, the monumental ambition of architectural decoration serves as a model for the socialist realism that Kemény now envisions. Maybe it was already in 1931 that the lack of such heroism, which Kemény was deploring in Peri's work. In any case, it seems obvious that Peri's rather clumsy and one could say caricatural figures defy any such notions of heroism and idealization. Rather, they embody a realism of the everyday and the banal, closer to the comical than to the tragic, and which effectively links them back to Daumier's negation of the classical ideal. It is in this line in which Peri will pursue further in his relief sculptures in his second exile in London in the mid-1930s, at precisely the moment when Kemény, now in Moscow, is most doggedly fixated on propagating the heroic idealization of social reality. Thank you for your patience.